Hello, and a very big welcome to National Book Festival Presents. My name is Marie Arana, and I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress. National Book Festival Presents is a year-round series, an extension of the very popular annual National Book Festival, which launched at the end of September. This year, for the first time, we bring you the festival in virtual format on a platform that you can access by going to loc.gov/bookfest and connecting to a vast offering of wonderful programs on books of every genre for every age. But here we are, starting up a new season of National Book Festival Presents, and it's my great privilege to bring you yet another fascinating segment. This time, we offer the prize-winning, best-selling American historian, Jon Meacham. It's not often that a biographer, laboring for years on a life story that he or she suspects might be important for our times, hits publication day at the perfect moment, the perfect storm, when all of us can understand just how right the times are for this particular book and this precise story. That is exactly what we have here with Jon Meacham's biography of the late John Lewis, a towering figure in civil rights, a man whose courage, conviction, and clear sense of justice have come to represent what it means, what it should mean, to be American, to have a higher purpose, to make democracy live up to its promise. John's book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, tells us exactly this story. So let me tell you a bit about John, who is well known to us here at the Library of Congress. He's done his research in our halls, and over the years, he's joined us often to tell our audiences about the American story. A former journalist and leading editor at Time and Newsweek magazines, as well as the executive editor of Random House, John has always managed to write books that somehow connect history to the immediate moment. Books that tell us something about ourselves as Americans and about the crucibles we've faced, whether it be Thomas Jefferson finding the words to define a new country, or the friendship forged in wartime between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, or the political travails of Andrew Jackson, or the abiding, ever-contentious, ever-evolving spirit of the American people. John has a knack for giving us a new lens by which to see ourselves. You can find John's illuminating talk about American ingenuity and John Lewis's undeniable part in it among the National Book Festival programs that are available to you right now at loc.gov/bookfest. Please also stay tuned to the very end of this program when we'll talk briefly with Adrienne Cannon, the library's lead curator on America's transformative civil rights years. But now, please welcome Carla Hayden, the 14th Librarian of Congress, in conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Jon Meacham, about a civil rights hero and a great American, the indomitable John Lewis. Dr. Hayden?
Thank you so much, and we are honored to be joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian, Mr. Jon Meacham. And Mr. Meacham, it's a personal honor for me because I have been a fan for so long. And your book about John Lewis couldn't be more timely. And I wondered, he's also a hero. And I wondered, you're both what they call sons of the South. And how did you lure him to, well, you might not have had to lure him, but how did you get him to talk to you, write about this, and then at that crucial time at the end of his life?
Sure. Well, I think if you're going to have heroes, I would have John Lewis first. I would put me way down on that list. I met Congressman Lewis 28 years ago. In 1992 on an election night in Atlanta. And I was what I called myself the Atlanta bureau chief of the Chattanooga Times. I was in fact the Atlanta bureau. So it was a self-appointment. I ran it out of room 216 of the La Quinta Inn on I-85. But there was a Senate runoff in Georgia, and one of the currencies of power on an election night, as you know, is not to be seen. If you're a politician, you're supposed to be off doing priestly things. You're probably just watching TV somewhere else. But I walked in, and there was John Lewis and Lillian, his wonderful wife, just standing in the ballroom in Atlanta with the Georgia Democratic Party. And I went up to him and quite tremulously asked a couple of questions. Chiefly, did he miss the clarity of the movement? At that point, the debates in the country were about affirmative action, about quotas. We just come through the Civil Rights Act of 1991, 92, and it was more of a mess, honestly, than access to the voting booth and taking down the Jim Crow signs. And he gave a John Lewis-like answer, which was thoughtful, deep, and ultimately hopeful, which was that you have to continue the march until we bring about what he called and Dr. King called the beloved community, which is another way of talking about the kingdom of God on earth. And it began a 30-year dispute, really. We argued about this because I don't believe that you can bring about the kingdom of God on earth. Now, I have Reinhold Niebuhr and Barack Obama on my side, but John Lewis had Dr. King on his side, and he was John Lewis. So he always won the argument. We did share a regional connection. He grew up in Troy, Alabama. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But we were from radically different parts of that South. He was 30 years older than I was, and obviously a Black man. I was a younger white guy who had missed the high water mark of the movement. And so I had an intellectual interest in it, a historical interest in it. The fascinating thing about John, as you know, was that quiet, persistent, enveloping charisma. And it was quiet. He listened very carefully. He would always lean in. But then when he spoke, it was like Amos or Isaiah. There was this deep Moses. It was this deep prophetic voice speaking to the culture. And I always knew I wanted to write about him. We stayed in touch those years. We'd often talk on a commemoration, an anniversary, after some kind of news event. I would save the notes, and very Library of Congress like, and would try to continue this conversation about the perfectibility of reality. And he never fully convinced me. I surely never convinced him. But the difference is that he was willing to die for his vision. He was willing to shed blood, and did shed blood, for this notion that we could, in fact, if our dispositions of heart and mind were in the right place, we could bring about the way of love on earth. And I just don't think there was an equivalent figure in the second half of the 20th century, certainly after 1968, who combined the consistent adherence to that vision, the consistent stand he took in the arena, insisting that our better angels could in fact triumph over our worst instincts. And when I was standing on the bridge, the Pettus Bridge in March with my family and about 1,000 other people, and I realized, listening to him, this is last March, that this was probably his last trip. The pancreatic cancer, which also claimed Justice Ginsburg, had brought him back, interestingly, more or less to the weight and shape he was when he'd been on the bridge the first time. And so there was this compelling kind of vision of him in this place with Jim Lawson, who's now in his 90s, with Ruby Bridges, with Speaker Pelosi, with these people who then and now continue this push toward making us a more perfect union. And I realized that I wanted to tell his story through a theological lens, largely because so many of us, I'm a Christian, I'm not a very good one. As Robert Louis Stevenson once said, the duty of the Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully. And by that standard, I'm pretty good at it because I fail all the time. But I wanted to find a way to show how profession could come closer to practice. And I have never met anyone in public or private life who more clearly and compellingly embodied the profession and the practice more than Jon.
And that comes through in the book and might surprise some people, the fact that the faith, and you're a man of faith, and the connection to sainthood, and the fact that saints aren't perfect. But his faith, what do you think it started so strong? The preaching to the chickens with him, and when he was a child, all of that.
Yeah, there were about 3 tributaries that formed the river of John Lewis. One was an innate revulsion against the segregated order he encountered in Pike County, Alabama in the 1940s. The only white person he saw with any regularity was the mailman. So he had what's pretty again, the compelling evidence is he just revolted against that it struck him as inherently unfair. And that was something that it just came to him. It was truly innate. He was the great grandson of a slave. His great grandfather, Frank Carter, had been born in slavery. He knew him. His grandfather and father were both sharecroppers. They had a number of different jobs, but they farmed there in Pike County. So one tributary was the revulsion against segregation. Another tributary was the church itself. Baptist Church, AME Church, and he heard the gospel. He heard the Sermon on the Mount. He heard the prophets of the Hebrew Bible who promised a different kingdom. Remember, the great passages of Isaiah and Amos and others, Daniel, are all about transformation. It's about a regeneration of creation. And justice will come down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It's not a mistake that it was a desert people who framed their prophetic hopes in terms of irrigation, right? I mean, it was very practical in that sense. And Jon had a consistent sense that he was less interested in heaven as a place to go to and was more interested in heaven as a place to make on earth and to try to achieve a kind of perfection within time and space. The third tributary is, and it goes to the work of the library, it goes to the work of the press, of books, was the media itself. He saw the pictures of Emmett Till after the lynching in 1955. He and Emmett Till were about the same age. He read about the Brown decision. He sat waiting in the summer of 1954 for all his new white friends to come to school with him, because the Supreme Court had made this decision. So therefore, all the white people were coming. And of course, it never happened. When he was at American Baptist here in Nashville, he was here. His first fall here was the fall of the Little Rock Nine, and that remarkable stand for the rule of law and the rule of justice over in Arkansas. So Autherine Lucy, who had attempted to desegregate the University of Alabama in 1956. So he read about all of these things. And centrally, he heard Martin Luther King on the radio, because 1955-56 was the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And it began in the early December 1955 when Rosa Parks made her decision and lasted through much of 56. And he heard a sermon of King's on the radio from Dexter, which was Paul's letter to the American Christian. So it was one of Dr. King's somewhat labored metaphorical sermons about what Paul would write to the Christians in America in the 20th century. And that changed his life. So you had these 3 tributaries that formed this rushing stream. that when he came to Nashville in the fall of 1957, he was ready. He was ready to do something about segregation because of a vision rooted in faith. And he understood that the world itself was, if not moving very quickly toward that, but that there were, in fact, signs that the country was beginning to reckon with this.
And he was the youngest person on the March on Washington in 63.
Right.
And had to be edited basically down to the last minute. And people think of him as the elder statesman, but he was a young whippersnapper and really wanted to say some things. And even
he was the Black Lives Matter. He was the Black Lives Matter guy of August 1963. And it's funny, when you read the first draft of the speech that got the Archbishop of Washington and the Justice Department and the White House all upset, it's not that Sherman-esque. And I think actually, if we didn't know about the first draft, we would think the second draft was pretty tough as well. And so, the march is a fascinating moment and it's a great inflection point in the life of the nation. I had a chance, I interviewed Harry Belafonte for this, the coolest man on the planet, by the way.
Yes.
Without a doubt. Just no doubt. An incredibly remarkable figure who spent a lot of his own money and was a hugely important supporter of Dr. King's and SNCC and SCLC. Dr. King spent a lot of time in New York in the Belafonte apartment. So Harry's got notes that Dr. King would make for speeches and would leave them, in the guest room. And he had the wisdom to grab them and hold on to them. But Belafonte told me that, of course, Martin's speech, as he put it, was so brilliant. But to him, the most important speech of the day was John Lewis's, because it was the speech of the students. John was 23 at the time and had been involved in the movement really since he was 19, when he started the sit-ins, 19 and 20, the sit-ins in Nashville. And, the Kennedy administration was not excited, to say the least, about having 250,000 Black people show up and possibly complicate the congressional deliberation of the Civil Rights Act that had been proposed on June 11th of 63. Parenthetically, three things happened on June 11th, 1963. One is George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door in Tuscaloosa. That night, President Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act. And 2 hours later, Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi, all in one day. So this was a hectic period for contemporary American history. The Kennedy administration convinced the organizers not to have the march go toward the Capitol, but to go to the memorial. That was a compromise, to have it in the shadow of Lincoln. It was the right one, but it wasn't. That was not the first choice of the organizers. The organizers wanted to be on the steps of the Capitol demanding action. So that happened. The other, to me, fascinating thing is the Kennedy administration had stationed not one, but two people inside the Lincoln Memorial ready to cut the microphone to John Lewis's speech if Lewis went off script. And one of them had a LP of Mahalia Jackson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands," ready to play that, blasting over the loudspeakers to cover the fact that they might have had to censor Lewis.
And to think that he was 23, he was the rebel, he was the one that they were worried about. And then years later, one of his last acts, public acts, was to go to Black Lives Matter Plaza and stand there. And do you think he had that sense of the baton being passed, that these are the young people now that are doing what we tried to do and we're successful?
John Lewis fundamentally understood the power of story. He understood the power of narrative. And one of the reasons he undertook the number of commemorations he did, always taking members of Congress back to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham every year, was not for self-aggrandizement. but was to keep the story alive, to keep the lantern burning, because he understood that if he could make the connection between his own life and the remarkable changes that had occurred and the remarkable changes that still have to occur, if he could show lawmakers and show the country that human beings had the capacity to make these remarkable changes in the past, that we could do it now. And so there was a poetic and quite well thought out reason for his taking pains in the weeks before he died, for his going to Lafayette Park and standing there. And this is not to make a point, not to say that it was in any way cynical, but he understood that there would be photographers. He understood that it meant something that the man who had been on the Pettus Bridge, the man who had been on the Freedom Rides, the man who had been arrested 40 times during the movement, the man who had been beaten in Rock Hill and Montgomery and Birmingham, who had spent time at Parchman in Mississippi, he understood that it mattered that there was a bridge, if you will, between the high water mark of the civil rights movement, which is forever in danger of slipping into myth and legend, and the very hard work that has to be done today. And the movement is not myth and it's not legend because it wasn't foreordained then. It was a remarkable and close run thing. As Wellington said of Waterloo, it was the damnedest close run thing you ever saw in your life. And you think about the factors: state sanctioned, white supremacist, law enforcement led violence to prevent the full implications of the Declaration of Independence from being applied to everyone. That was true 60 years ago. It is to some extent true today. And if it's true to any extent, then we owe it to the founding ideals of the country to try to make them real. And that's what John fully understood and, again, was willing to die for.
You mentioned Justice Ginsburg and then, of course, Congressman Lewis and the passing so close together. And there's a part in your book that emphasizes, I have your book right here, I keep petting it right here. That's the most gripping about the fact that Martin Luther King had been assassinated in April. And Congressman Lewis was very active with the Robert Kennedy campaign. In fact, the scene that is shown quite a bit about Robert Kennedy going out to the crowd at Indianapolis, in your book, you mentioned that John Lewis was the one who basically gave him the words and told him, you have to get up there. That's not always portrayed. And then in June, John Lewis was upstairs in the hotel suite waiting with other people part of the campaign for Robert Kennedy to come up. And when they got the word, he fell to his knees in agony, John Lewis, and said, why? So that type of despair, some people feel that type of thing now. And the idea of hope in history and looking back and giving people hope. What do you think in terms of Congressman Lewis and how he was able to survive that? That was devastating.
It's devastating. 1968 is worth remembering. We lost 46 Americans a day on average in Vietnam, not wounded, but killed. The year began with Tet. Senator Kennedy gets in the race on March 16th, quite late. March 31st is the day that Lyndon Johnson got out of the race. It was a Sunday. That was the day that Dr. King preached what would become his final Sunday sermon at the cathedral in Washington. He's killed on Thursday night. Senator Kennedy is on his way to Indianapolis. John Lewis is basically one of the advance guys. And he says, Kennedy called from the plane and said, the police chief wanted them to not come in. Interestingly, Indianapolis is one of the few cities that escaped large-scale violence, not least because of what Robert Kennedy said that night. And then, of course, the riots and the despair in action that unfolded that weekend. To John Lewis, though, despair was a sin, because the whole forward motion of his life was that hope was possible, that progress was possible. And you don't have to listen to a boring white guy from the South to believe that. Just listen to him. He said again and again when he was in Congress, if you don't think America can change, come walk in my shoes. So here's a man who's born great-grandson of a slave in segregated Alabama, who dies eulogized by presidents and mourned by millions. And I don't use that dichotomy as a sign of the temporal honors. It's not just about that. It's about what he did for the country that led to those eulogies and that mourning. And what he did again and again and again is he walked into the teeth of seemingly hopeless causes and made them hopeful. And he did it by a fundamental moral appeal that we were a better country than we were acting like. And that consistent message, a message backed up by his own physical bravery, remarkable physical bravery. I sometimes think, we celebrate Gettysburg and Normandy and Pleiku. Selma, Alabama is a battlefield. John Lewis is a war hero. He bore the wounds of physical bravery, and he did it just as surely as if he had taken up traditional arms and served overseas. And I think that for us, in a moment that is not unlike 1968, honestly, because of the declining faith in public institutions, because of the ferocity of the time. After, as you say, Senator Kennedy's killed the first week of June. Chicago Democratic Convention, remember, descends into chaos and violence. And on Election Day 1968, 55% of America voted for either Richard Nixon or George Wallace for president. George Wallace carried 13.5% of the popular vote and 5 states in the Electoral College. So we sometimes see this as, Vice President Humphrey almost beat Nixon. That's true. But 13.5% of Americans thought that George Wallace should be president 52 years ago. So are we really that far from that moment? Not really. Without being partisan, the 45th president is in many ways, people want to see him as a unique figure. That lets us off the hook a little bit, because what he really is the fullest manifestation of perennial American forces that we need to do all we can to keep in abeyance, as opposed to having them flow through the body politic. And so I think that the Lewis message, which is love your neighbor and love your enemy, 2 incredibly difficult things. I like most of my neighbors. I don't want to love my enemies. They're my enemies, for Christ's sake. Why would I want to love my enemy? That's just crazy. But it's what Moses taught us. It's what Jesus taught us. And it's what John Lewis did in our time. He hasn't been dead. He's been dead barely 2 months. And I do, as you say, I make the case for his essential Christian sainthood. Yes. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, is the old insight. And they don't have to be perfect to be saints. And I don't want to put him in stained glass, and I don't want to put him on a pedestal, except I want him to be on a tall enough pedestal that all of us can see him. Because if you see him, then you have a better chance of emulating him.
And you mentioned a gentleman, Jim Lawson, who was seen for many people for the first time at Congressman Lewis's funeral. and he's in his 90s, but he was the person that really played a vital role too. And I have to just quote what he said. It was not enough, he would say, simply to endure a beating. It was not enough to resist the urge to strike back at an assailant. That urge can't be there. You have to do more than just not hit back. You have to have no desire to hit back. You have to love that person who's hitting you. When I read that, I thought, that's a tall order, as you said. But he did it. But John Lewis did it. He believed in that.
James Lawson may be the most important American that not enough people know. That's probably a bigger category than you or I would like to admit, but he's right up there. He was the son of a Methodist minister. He himself is a Methodist minister. He was a conscientious objector during the Korean War. He went to jail for his refusal to participate in the draft. He went to India and it was too late to meet Gandhi himself, but spent time with Gandhi's lieutenants, began to understand. Howard Thurman had kind of pioneered that journey for the Black experience to intersect with the Indian nonviolent movement. And Lawson came back as a kind of embodiment of the Black church, the Methodist social consciousness, and the means that Gandhi had used in India. And he's at Oberlin one day and encounters Martin Luther King. They were both visiting. And King realized that Lawson had this set of experiences. And he said, "You're exactly what we need in the South." And so Lawson came to Nashville. He teamed up with a very important minister here named Kelly Miller Smith, who was the pastor of the largest Black church here. And Lawson said, I want to start doing workshops in nonviolence. And Smith is the one who said, John Lewis is ready. Interesting, right? It's like, oh God, my heart is ready. There's something very biblical about John's whole life. For one thing, he wasn't John Lewis when he was growing up. He was Robert or Bob to his family. And like Abraham, like Elijah, like Peter, he received a different name when he received a different work. He came to Nashville. He went to a school on a hill, went to a mountaintop. His family was not thrilled in the early days about his activism. So as Jesus said, you will have to leave your family to take up your cross and follow me. It goes on and on. And Lawson, meeting in a basement not far from here of the Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, a little red brick church, taught John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel how to be nonviolent and how to fill that tall order. You're right, that's the tallest of orders. Who wants to do that? I don't want to do that. But they did. And they changed a country. And there's a huge debate. You know this very well. There's a huge debate in this country about the efficacy of nonviolence versus more rigorous forms of protest. There was a huge debate then. John Lewis was out of fashion beginning in 1966 when he lost this chairmanship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Stokely Carmichael. So this idea that somehow or another there was this Brigadoon-like world where everybody agreed and everybody wore a coat and tie and they carried their Bibles and all the white people like me said, oh, we were wrong, so sorry. That's just not right. It was touch and go and complicated and contingent and conditional, which is what history is. But they moved the needle. They made the Union more perfect. And is not perfectible in the end, but they were willing to die for a country that, if it heeded its better angels, would be worth dying for.
And that power of hope, being able to gird yourself and move forward. The epilogue and his parting words. And you mentioned that in the passing of Congressman Lewis and Justice Ginsburg and so many other people during this time that we might never know with the pandemic, that there was some comfort in his afterward, though. and because he just approaches it, how to march forward. The journey begins with faith, faith in the dignity and the worth of every human being. And I think there's something brewing in America that's going to bring people closer and closer together. How do you feel about that?
I pray that he's right. And he was always right more often than I was. If you lived the life he lived, you had to believe that, as Dr. King said in his eulogy for the 4 girls who were killed in Birmingham at 16th Street Baptist Church, he said, God can bring good out of evil. That was the text that Dr. King returned to. And if you lived that life, you have to believe that good can come out of evil. It's an essential thing to believe, because oftentimes it seems that all we've got is evil. We certainly have a higher proportion of it than good. And I don't want to, this is not a homily, this is not a 4th of July oration. I don't mean to in any way minimize the complications of these issues. But it is the fact, a clinical, discernible, observable fact, that the world was one way when John Lewis came into the public arena, and it was a different world when he left it. And isn't that really the test we should all try to apply to ourselves? Can we make the world a different and better place? And if he could do it, walking into tear gas and billy clubs and prison cells from which he might not have ever left, if he could do that, then can't the rest of us vote and speak up and speak out? And I'm not a partisan. It's a fundamentally American thing to do, to say we said we were devoted to an intellectual and moral proposition that we were all created equal. It was a limited definition then. It is still limited, but the people we honor, the people we pay homage to, are the people who expanded that definition, not those who constricted it. And to me, one of the lessons of John Lewis's life is that if you can broaden your arms as opposed to clenching your fists, history will honor you.
Thank you, Mr. Jon Meacham, for giving us hope in history. We really need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks to Jon Meacham and Librarian of Congress Carla Hayden for that stirring conversation. Before we close this program, I'd like to invite Adrienne Cannon, the library's award-winning specialist on African American history, to join me to tell you a bit about the library's holdings in civil rights history. Adrienne is the primary curator for our African American collections, and she oversees the NAACP records, the largest single collection ever acquired by the library and the most heavily used. She is curator of the current exhibition, Rosa Parks in Her Own Words. Adrienne, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning.
Can you tell us a bit about the Civil Rights era collections in the Manuscript Division?
Yes, well, the Library of Congress is generally acknowledged as a leading repository for the study of the 20th century civil rights movement. The NAACP records, the largest single collection ever acquired by the library and annually the most heavily used, are the cornerstone of the library's civil rights resources. The Manuscript Division also administers the original records of the National Urban League, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, as well as the microfilmed records of the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These resources are enhanced by the personal papers of such prominent activists as Roy Wilkins, Thurgood Marshall, Arthur Spingarn, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Robert L. Carter, Louis Sullivan, Joseph Rowe, Mary Church Terrell, James Foreman, and Rosa Parks, and Jackie Robinson.
Thank you. And what other resources does the library hold on the civil rights movement?
In addition to the organizational records and personal papers in the manuscript division, the library holds a variety of formats such as photographs, films, and sound recordings, television broadcast, and radio broadcast. The American Folklife Center, which preserves the oral histories of individuals that participated in the civil rights movement firsthand, also holds several collections of oral histories. Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution collaborated on the Civil Rights History Project, a congressional initiative to survey existing oral history collections and add additional interviews.
It's a lot. It's a lot. And what materials does the library hold pertaining to John Lewis specifically?
Well, the James Foreman papers, James Foreman was the executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, more commonly known as SNCC, feature a variety of reports and memorandums and speeches that are related to John Lewis. The most noteworthy items are the drafts of John Lewis's 1963 March on Washington speech.
Right.
The library holds the original draft as well as the draft that Congressman Lewis delivered at the podium that day. And the speech that was delivered at the podium was hurriedly revised by James Foreman and John Lewis in an anteroom at the back of the statue of Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial on a portable typewriter. And it is actually written on the itinerary that was given to the co-chairs of the March on Washington. That itinerary was used as scrap paper. So if you look, you will see the draft of the speech, which you can see is hurriedly written because there are cross-outs and there are X's typed over typos. And then if you look at the back, you'll see the itinerary for the program.
That's a lot of material, and we invite the public to come and search through it. It's a wonderful, wonderful collection. Adrienne, thank you very much for connecting this presentation so firmly to the work that we do at the Library of Congress. And a big thanks to all of you for joining us today. Remember, you can see more fascinating programs like this one at loc.gov/bookfest. Thanks again.